22, no training, daddy issues, a recovering ugly duckling, and I'm about to get married. What's the worst that could happen? Let's get into it. Hey, what's going on, fam? And welcome to The Prompt, the show where curiosity might have killed the cat, but it will not kill the conversation. I'm your host, Damon, the relationship GPT, and let's get into today's prompt. Today, I want to talk to you about becoming a husband. Becoming a husband. Might I add, after 25 years of marriage, I'm still becoming a husband. It's an ongoing process. And I want to kind of lay out some stuff for you when it comes to becoming a husband, because we say there's not a guide to it, but the reality, there is a guide to it. But I want to take y'all on a journey with me. I want to talk to you about what it has taken for me to become the husband I am today. I was a great husband in my eyes, but a very flawed man. Or maybe I was a flawed husband, but a great man. It's one of the two. I can't remember. Let's go with I was a flawed husband, but a great man. Let's go with that one. I open this up, but I want to just bring you into the mind of a 22-year-old who's getting ready to marry a woman that he loves. And in case you hadn't followed me long, you know that I now believe love is a horrible reason, dumb reason, stupid reason to get married. It's an absolute horrible reason to get married. And even when we say the phrase falling in love, I don't want anyone to fall in love with me. Falling doesn't take effort. I want someone who's committed to learning to love me. And there's a significant difference in the two. So let's talk about this. I met my wife. Now, before my wife, you'll hear me sometimes talk about the three wives. At the time, I was ready to get married, but not ready for marriage. Those are two completely different things. And might I add, outside of pre-marriage education, there's nothing you can do to get ready for marriage. There are some things you can do to make marriage easier to navigate. There's some preventative things you can do so that marriage isn't unnecessarily difficult. But living together, talking about it ad nauseum, those are things that can help prepare you, not the living together part. Scratch that. Matter of fact, that can make it worse. Another discussion. But those are some things that can prepare you, but there's nothing like getting on the altar of marriage. There's nothing like laying down your life and your individuality to become one with someone else. There's nothing like it. And my brother and I were talking today, and I've had this conversation with a few different guys, is to me, as a man, the two greatest gifts that God can ever bestow on me is being a husband and being a father, preferably in that order. But being a husband, a present committed husband, and a present committed father, being intentional in both of those is the greatest gift that I believe that God can bestow upon a man, next to the gift of salvation. So let's talk about this thing, man. Let's get into it. When I got married, I was 22 years old. I had a kid on the way, and I found this woman that I wanted to get married to. Going back to the three wives scenario, when I met my wife, The women that had been in immediate proximity to me prior to me dating my wife were all women that I think could have or did make great wives. They had the wife gene in them. They just weren't the wife for me. You'll hear me say sometimes that my wife is not the first person I wanted to marry because of my immaturity, right? There's at least two other girls I would have wanted to marry. But my wife is the first woman I knew I needed to marry. Let me explain that a little bit. The other two young ladies, I could explain to you exactly why I felt I needed to marry them, or wanted to marry them, rather. I could articulate that they were smart. One of them really loved the Lord. The other was finding their way. They both kind of spoiled me. They had good conversation. They were attractive. I could articulate all of that. But when it came to my wife, she was all of those things, but there was something else that I couldn't explain. Like, I could fully articulate why I wanted to marry those women, but I couldn't fully articulate it why I knew I needed to marry my wife. And it took me 15, 16 years to figure that out. Husbands, I can help you get there quicker than I did if you're interested. Hit me up in the DM. But it took me 15, 16 years to figure that out, the why behind it, to fully figure it out. I started getting breadcrumbs around year 5 or 6, but to fully figure it out, to fully understand it. So I'm 22, baby on the way from another chick. This chick happened to be one of the ones that could have potentially been a wife. And given that I grew up without my biological dad, I was feeling compelled at one point early in the going before we broke up to, like, maybe I have to marry this girl because we're having a kid and I want to be there in my kid's life, and marriage may solidify that. But I had no daddy training. And when I say I was a recovering ugly duck, I didn't grow up thinking that I was the most handsome young man. Found out later some other women really, like, I don't know, you was tripping, but I didn't feel like that because I didn't have women approaching me, and I was I was and still am kind of shy. I'm introverted, and yeah, I'm a little bit. It's a little bit different. So I had this feeling of being the ugly duckling because I didn't have it as easy with the ladies as most of my friends did. And some of that might have just been I didn't shoot my shot. Different topic. So we get married. We go to the courthouse and get officially married. We have a wedding sometime later. I am terrified. Have you ever been terrified? I have. I was terrified. What the hell did I just do? I was terrified, man. So, but I did it. And this is how broke I was. We had to wait until my paycheck to pay the $80 for the license. I was terrified. I don't know what I just got into. Didn't have my own place at that time. It was rough. It was ill-advised looking back. It was ill-advised looking back. But yeah. So here we go. 22, no training. I got daddy issues, and I'm a recovering ugly duckling. And I'm married. Year 1, 2, the first year we actually lived with my mother-in-law. My pride still makes me embarrassed of that to this day. But after we get our own place, I'm the head of the house. I'm supposed to make decisions for the house. There's one problem with that. I don't have a clue. Let me rewind a little bit, give you a little additional context. Now, I had a stepfather. I grew up part of my life probably age 7 on, where I saw my mom in a healthy relationship, in a healthy marriage with my stepfather. But my stepfather didn't necessarily, I observed what he did, but that doesn't necessarily mean that I understood it, how woefully under-equipped I was. And I watched some of the things that my mom did put my stepfather through. And I'm like, nah, I ain't going for that. I ain't gonna let my wife do me like my mom is doing my stepfather. And so in doing that, man, I'm sitting there and it's wild. I've got to be the head of the house. I got to be the head of the house, but I don't have a clue. I've read it in scripture. I still don't have a clue. And because I had to be the head of the house, I thought that to a degree that meant she just followed me blindly. I'll listen to what you say, but I'm really not going to consider it. Yeah, that created a lot of tension in our house, as you can imagine. And ultimately, it led to, I've talked about this before, it led to us having a car repossessed. It led to us, we had to drive one of my mother-in-law's cars for a while. It didn't have no heat in it. We had the little cigarette lighter heater you plug in, man, that didn't keep you warm. It was crazy. It was crazy. A lot. End up losing a home along with the property that my mother-in-law had gifted us as our wedding present. It was terrible. It was terrible. And not only I had a kid that was on the way when I married my wife. He was born. Then a few months later, my wife and I got married. Then we had another kid on the way together a couple of years later. So we got all of this tension going on, and we're just trying to figure it out. We're trying to figure it out. And it was hard. It was really, really, really hard, because I'm trying to become something that I had not seen or been taught to be. And when you listen to even the religious circles, spiritual circles, they don't really have a bead on it, even though being and becoming a husband is right there in the scripture. So after we went through, or right before we went through one of the darkest seasons of our marriage, I got a clue. Start dialing into God more, start becoming more sensitive. See, here's one of the things I always thought in my marriage. I always perceived my wife as more spiritual than me. I always felt like she was more spiritual. And that allowed me to somewhat take a spiritual back seat, become spiritually lazy. Even though I ministered my first sermon at 15, I was a pastor for early season of our marriage. Listen, guys, if you are in ministry and you get married, I strongly advise you to take a break from ministry while you create the bond with your wife, then get back into ministry. I know that's going to be unpopular, but I'm telling you, any major shifts, even in career, you may need to step back from some things so you can prioritize your wife and your family before you continue growing, or else it could rip you apart. So I started to kind of tap in with God a little more. God told me some specific things before the darkest days came. One of the things he told me, he said, son, you can build or destroy. I wish that you would build. That's a different episode to give you more context on that. But the other thing that God told me was this. God told me, I can't talk to her and you talk to her too. One of us has got to be quiet, and I'm not going to try and overtalk you. So I had to make a decision make a decision for me to be quiet so that God could get through to my wife. We went through the dark days. We got into some stuff, but I continued to pursue God because I started to figure out the way to her is through him. He gifted his daughter to me. See, that's one of the things I want y'all to understand. If you're getting married, or you're already married, you are not making vows to the other person beside you. You're making vows to the Father about the daughter that he gifted you. You're making vows to the Father about the son he entrusted you with. I want you to understand that you're a gift to each other from God, which means that your vows are not to each other. Your vows are to him. I feel like if more people understood that maybe they would be a little less, they'd be a little more reluctant about running down to the altar, because then they would be like, oh, this ain't just me talking to a person. Because my brother's grandfather, Mr. Peck, God rest his soul, and we'll say something and we like, well, they said it, Ramrod. They said it. He like, they got a tongue just like anybody else. They lips part and they can lie too. That's true. So those words to each other don't mean as much, nearly as much, as when you make those words to the Father about the person standing in front of you. Because then when you lied to him, not them. Let me say it for you real slow again. When you change the direction of your vows so that you're not making vows between you and her, but you're making vows between you and him, that will change the trajectory of your marriage, because now you have a different level of accountability. Now, if you already kind of don't have a true accountability to God, none of that's going to matter anyway, because you lie to her and you'll lie to God. You lie to him, you'll lie to God. That doesn't matter. But if you take your relationship with God seriously and you make your vow to him and not her, it transforms some things. So I had to get closer to God in order to get closer to her. And if you've ever seen me do the triangle teaching, and I'll have to drop a link to it in down in the description. The more you mature towards God, the more you gain God's perspective on your spouse. See, when you're down here, let's say this is the bottom of the triangle. You're here, she's here. God's at the top. When you're in this triangle and you really want to transform your marriage, you can't keep doing this, because between the two of you is you're fighting through noise, and that's why you don't have clarity. But if you want to get your marriage better, instead of doing this, one of you, and hopefully both of you, have got to start to do this. Somebody's got to move closer to God. All it takes is one person to move closer to God in order to really transform your marriage. Why? Because the closer I get to God, the more I get God's perspective on my spouse. Not only that, I start to rise above the noise that's not only cutting me off from her, but also cutting me off from him. And when I gain his perspective on my spouse, I gain a greater level of compassion, a greater level of forgiveness, a greater level of grace, greater level of understanding, greater level of patience, long suffering. I start to develop the true fruit of the Spirit because I matured towards him. And after I matured towards him, it creates the opportunity for her to do the same, or for him to do the same. But someone's got to mature towards him. So I had these choices, and I want to give you the 3 choices I had to work through. As I mature towards God, we're going through the darkest season of our marriage, and I had 3 choices. Choice number 1, leave. Get out of there. Don't let the back door hit you where the good Lord split you. Let's go. Leave. Let's leave. You can parent your kids. They're a little bit older. You can get them to a certain point. They'll be resilient. Do you know that children are not as resilient as you think it is when it comes to a divorce of their parents, that they have a tendency to blame themselves? And especially when they didn't see it coming, like the environment is not overly toxic. You can tell there's some tension, but you just figure that's the norm. And then all of a sudden the marriage is over. That can really wreck them. So you can leave. You can be selfish. You can stop thinking about her. You can stop thinking about your kids, and you can leave. Option number 2, you can stay out of obligation and duty, out of responsibility, do the responsible thing. Stay there for the kids. Problem with that approach is usually once the kids are gone, you have nothing else. But I will say this, in the darkest days of our marriage, my love for my children, God used that to cause me to be patient while he taught, while he spoke, while he worked with my wife. He used my children to cause me to be patient with first them, with first patient, well, first patient with her, right? Because I love them. Secondly, patient with myself as I work through the process of becoming a husband. So I could leave or I could stay out of obligation and responsibility, but that only lasts so long. Or I can stay out of a sense of purpose. God revealed to me the purpose for our marriage. Ultimately, that's the option I chose. I'm supposed to be here because of purpose. Leave, stay out of obligation, duty, and responsibility, or stay because of God's purpose for the two of you. I chose purpose. The real glue to marriage is not how well you communicate. It is not how much you love, because we love imperfectly, and we love and we fail in love, not a choice of love, not a learning to love typically. But the glue to marriage is shared purpose. And the thing that so many people get wrong about shared purpose is or purpose in marriage in general, is you believe that in order for y'all to achieve purpose, someone's purpose has to die. But the reality, and I have an episode on this where I call it Voltroning your marriage, that our two purposes should come together to create a stronger, bigger, greater purpose. No one purpose has to die. They should come together. The two should become one. And our shared purpose coming together makes for a stronger purpose. What is purpose? Something greater than yourself that your marriage has to serve. I like to call it tending to your garden. What garden is your marriage designed to tend to? Every marriage has a garden to tend to. Some of those are very grand. Some of those seem almost innocuous. They seem like it's below grade. It doesn't, but it has great reach and it has great impact. What is the garden that your marriage was designed to tend to? The reason there is so much chaos in your home is because your marriage doesn't have a garden, or the garden is overrun with weeds. You're not tending to it. So I chose stay purpose. Let's work on the garden that our marriage was designed to tend to. So what did I do? How did I execute on staying that helped me to continue to grow and become? I got super quiet. I let God speak, not only to her, but to me, to show me where I could be a better husband. That led to me doing step number 2, looking for reasonable examples in the scripture and around my life of what godly Christ husbands look like. What do they look like? One of the marriages that came to my mind was one of my childhood pastors and his wife. And I think he was like, I'm sure he wasn't a perfect man, but the type of father and husband he demonstrated to be, and they're still married to this day, was something to aspire to. Go and look for the good examples. And I'm not talking about on TV, the Cosbys and the Jeffersons or whatever. Yeah, you can look at some of that. But no, I want you to look at real life, tangible examples where you can go and ask questions. Like if you look at our marriage, I don't want you to put it on a pedestal, but if you believe that I'm doing something right as a husband, reach out to me like, hey man, this is where I'm struggling. Have you faced this struggle? How did you overcome it if you did? I'm there. I'm there. So I got quiet. I looked for reasonable examples. Then, and here's the big one, I start being accountable in my home. Forget what she has done. What are you doing? And not doing out of a sense of trying to show her up, not doing out of a sense of duty and responsibility, not doing so that you can leverage and throw your head and pound your chest and say, look at the great husband I am. Not doing it for that, but doing it with a pure heart and motive, being accountable. Being accountable. Some of you right now might be where I was when I started. You might be older, but you still had no training. You still have daddy issues. You maybe were a recovering ugly duckling, or maybe you're recovering a hoe. Used to slanging it everywhere. But you want to be a better husband. You want to embrace your flaws and work on them as a husband and as a man. I would encourage you to consider what I just said to you. All right, fam, listen. So let me sum all this up for you. Remember, I was 22 years old, no training, daddy issues, recovering ugly duckling. So how do you become that husband? How do you move from being flawed man, great husband, flawed husband, great man? It starts here. First, you've got to acknowledge that you may not have a clue on how to be a husband. Now, you might have to acknowledge that to your accountability partner first, and then you got to acknowledge it to your wife. And y'all work together on that. And give her room to make some acknowledgments too if she needs to. But it's not about that. The next thing is you got to stop pursuing her directly. You've got to pursue her through God. God will give you the plan. He'll show it to you. Okay? Next, you got to make sure that you are there out of a sense of purpose, pure purpose, not out of obligation, duty, responsibility, but I'm there because I believe we have a shared purpose. We just got to find it. We got to find the garden that we need to tend to. All right? Then I want you to understand this. You got to get quiet. You got to look for reasonable examples, and you've got to have someone who can hold you accountable to the process of becoming a better husband. Listen, that's all I have for you. Remember, what doesn't get talked about doesn't get healed, and what doesn't get asked doesn't get answered. And I'll see you on the next episode of The Prompt. God bless.